He raised his voice, so I raised my hand. That's how an officer justified slapping a 16-year-old black teenager across the face, in open court in front of the jury, and under the watch of a judge who didn't even blink. No one stood up. No one said a word. Because to them, that boy was just part of the scenery. Another body in a system that punishes blackness long before it ever asks why. But then the courtroom doors opened, and the man who walked in wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a journalist. He was the boy's father, wearing a charcoal suit and a gleaming badge, deputy director of the FBI, Great Lakes Division. And suddenly, the boy they had dismissed wasn't just a teenager. He was the son of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country, a man with the authority to turn that slap into evidence before a federal grand jury. If your system can strike a child without knowing who he is, how many others are being struck simply because no one bothers to ask? What state are you living in? And in your courtrooms, is justice watching, or is it just trained to look away? Courtroom 2 of the Fairborn District Court was unnaturally silent for a Monday morning. Gray light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the tiled floor in the defendant's chair, where Tobias Reed, a 16-year-old black teenager, sat with his hands resting calmly on his lap, his gaze unflinching. Across the room, Officer Brandon Holt, his uniform crisply pressed, was addressing the jury with a voice so composed it bordered on arrogant. He spoke as if the courtroom was hosting an award ceremony, not a hearing for abuse of authority. The defendant was aggressive, threatening toward myself and my fellow officer, uncooperative, and actively resisting law enforcement. Holt declared, glancing at Tobias as if he were inspecting damaged merchandise. Judge Ronald Avery, silver-haired and stone-faced, offered no interruption. His subtle nod, barely more than a twitch, was the first sign that the verdict had likely been written before court was ever in session. Tobias didn't argue, didn't frown. He stayed quiet. But it wasn't fear that held his tongue. It was a practiced kind of self-defense known to those judged first by the color of their skin. Defense attorney Kendra Voss hadn't yet responded when something unexpected happened. Holt stepped down from the stand and walked deliberately toward Tobias, supposedly to demonstrate the incident in question. But the look in his eyes had shifted. No longer that of a public servant, but a man threatened by a black teenager who had the audacity to remain still in the face of unchecked power. Tobias raised his head, his deep, dark eyes locked with Holt's. "Is that how you define the law?" he asked, his voice soft as air. A question, not a provocation, not an accusation. Just a question, but it landed like a slap to the ego. Holt roared. Smack. The sound of a palm against Tobias' cheek cracked through the silent chamber. No one moved fast enough. No one dared to rise. Blood welled on Tobias' face. But he didn't lower his head. He didn't cry out. He slowly turned his face back toward the rear of the courtroom, toward the large double doors, now swinging open, as a man stepped inside. Charcoal gray suit, a gleaming badge over his left chest. Dorian Reed, deputy director of the FBI's Great Lakes Division. His father, a man who had trained hundreds of agents to read liars, now staring straight at a uniformed officer who had just struck his son. Tobias said nothing, but his eyes, fixed on his father, spoke for an entire generation, punished not for what they did, but simply for existing. The storm hadn't broken with shouting. It had begun with a look and a slap aimed at the wrong boy. For 30 long seconds after the blow, the courtroom remained still. No officers moved. No juror spoke. Judge Avery adjusted his glasses and nodded, just a nod. But to Tobias Reed, it thundered louder than any gavel. It was the first sentence, delivered without argument, without defense. Just a look, a nod, and a black boy convicted by the thick air of prejudice. Officer Brandon Holt, briefly rattled, returned to his controlled demeanor. He glanced around the room like a man who had just completed a duty. In his mind, Tobias had needed discipline, and he had graciously stepped in where the boy's parents had failed. Dorian Reed still stood at the doorway. He gave no signal, demanded nothing. He simply watched. And that alone made 3 nearby officers step half a pace back. No one said his name, but the air had shifted. Kendra Voss gently gripped Tobias' shoulder. She stood, voice ice cold, motion to suspend proceedings immediately due to physical assault on the defendant during trial. Judge Avery replied like a machine. There is no indication the incident affected testimony. Proceed. Holt returned to the stand, this time with the smugness of a man who believes he's won. He recounted the events like reciting a script. Tobias had crossed the line, threatened an older officer, and displayed clear hostility. Every word painted over the truth in whitewash. Tobias remained still. His eyes moved across the room. A woman on the jury pursed her lips, avoiding his gaze. A middle-aged man pretended to review his notes. And Judge Avery, hand on gavel, expression blank, as though he had stopped listening long ago. Tobias didn't speak, didn't flinch. His silence wasn't surrender. It was evidence. Proof that in this place, a look could condemn faster than any verdict. In the back of the room, Dorian Reed began to move forward one step at a time. He said nothing. He wasn't angry. He had taught his agents. If you want to know who controls a room, don't listen to who's talking. Look for the one who doesn't have to speak to make everyone else quiet. Tobias was now doing exactly that. When Holt finished his statement, Judge Avery nodded again. Another nod, but this time Tobias smiled just slightly, as if acknowledging that if they planned to judge him by a glance, then he would answer with one they would never dare return. Justice doesn't need to scream. Sometimes, it only needs a stare without blinking. The air inside the Fairborn District Court had thickened like gunpowder fog. The jury no longer looked at Tobias as a defendant, but as a contradiction they didn't know how to process. A black teenager, sitting upright in a sterile white courtroom, daring to look power in the eye and ask it to explain itself. Officer Brandon Holt, still on the stand, tried to maintain composure, but his clenched fists around the paperwork betrayed the quiet fury rising in his gut. Tobias, now with a dark bruise blooming across his cheek, turned toward Holt again, not in defiance, not in anger, just a boy trying to understand. He asked, barely above a whisper, yet loud enough for every ear in the room to catch, "Is that how you define the law?" The question, short and soft, struck like armor-piercing steel. No resistance, no argument, just a question. Yet inside it was everything Holt couldn't endure. The presence of a sharp young black mind daring to question a system he believed untouchable. Holt lunged, like a beast whose mask had been ripped away. Before anyone could intervene, his hand flew again. Smack. A second slap, harder, crueler, echoed like a judge's gavel spun out of control. Tobias's head turned, hair falling across his face. Slowly, he wiped the blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. No whimper, no tears, just one line, spoken so calmly it chilled the spine. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." In the back row, Dorian Reed didn't move, but his eyes locked on Holt as if every fiber of his being was memorized in the face of the man who had just destroyed his own future. Judge Ronald Avery pounded the gavel, not to restore order, but to claw back some sense of control. He muttered something about unauthorized disruption, but his voice was lost beneath the rising murmur. Kendra Voss stepped beside Tobias. She didn't ask if he was okay. She knew he was, because Tobias's resilience wasn't in his blood. It was in his gaze, unblinking, steady. At the back of the room, Lila Brennan, a freelance journalist who had only shown up to chase a minor courtroom drama, hit record on her device. She didn't know what she had just captured, but instinct told her this wasn't news. This was an earthquake, and at the center of it wasn't Holt. It wasn't Avery. It was a 16-year-old boy who had turned a question into an indictment of the system itself, and a slap into evidence. During recess, Tobias Reed was taken to the holding room off the court's west wing, not in handcuffs, but not free either. 3 officers stood at the door as if he were a threat barely contained. Kendra Voss entered, carrying a bottle of water and a stack of files, but her eyes were locked on Tobias, especially on the chain that peeked from beneath his worn beige uniform shirt. "That necklace," she said slowly. "I've seen that insignia before." Tobias remained silent. Kendra sat across from him, Calm but firm, she extended her hand. You don't have to tell me anything. I just need to know who I'm protecting. After a pause, Tobias pulled the chain fully into view. Engraved on the tag, faint but unmistakable, were the words, Great Lakes Federal HQ Division 5, RED, Kendra Froze. She had worked with agents from that branch. And that last word, Reed, was random. Dorian Reed is your father? Tobias looked at her. No nod, no shake of the head. Just one answer. He's the kind of man this system only listens to when he's angry. Me, I'm the kind it only hears when I'm silent. The word sent a chill down Kendra's spine. She'd seen plenty of kids rage, yell, even lash out in courtrooms over the years. But Tobias didn't need to do anything. And that, more than anything else, was what made the world around him start to fall apart piece by piece. She suddenly recalled the officer who'd been stationed at the door when Tobias was brought in that morning. Officer Todd Renner. He glanced at Tobias's necklace, and instead of flaring up, he lowered his eyes, not out of fear, but because he realized too late that he had stepped on a landmine he had no authority to disarm. When Kendra returned to the courtroom, there was a faint smile tugging at her lips, not because she was happy, but because she now understood she was walking into a chess match where the defendant was the one holding the queen. Things shifted again when Lila Brennan, the young reporter, asked Tobias for a portrait. A shot of the silent hero, she said. Tobias declined, but as she inadvertently captured a candid frame of him turning away, the flash caught the necklace. The word FBI gleaming in silver like a silent declaration that shouted louder than any statement. Within 2 hours of that photo being posted on a small forum for journalists and attorneys, the hashtag #RNY began spreading like wildfire, not because Tobias' story had been fully told, but because a new question had begun to form. If he's the son of an FBI agent, why is he still being treated like this? And that question, not the title, not the name, was the real tremor, the kind no badge or bench could silence. Court was recessed. Lawyers left the chamber. The jury was guided into a private deliberation room, and Tobias Reed was escorted to a side hallway to the courthouse's secure holding area. Officer Todd Renner was the one assigned to escort him, though it was barely 20 feet of corridor. Still, the way Renner placed his hand on Tobias's shoulder, pressing just a little too hard, lowering his head as if to assert dominance, said more than 1,000 questions ever could. Once the holding room door shut, Renner and another officer approached Tobias's gray backpack, the only thing he had brought into court that morning. "Open it," Renner ordered. Tobias didn't ask why. He simply unzipped it, placed it on the table with quiet precision, not out of submission, but because he had nothing to hide. They rifled through everything. Textbooks, notebooks, a broken pen, a crushed sandwich his mother had packed. Each item was removed with the suspicion, usually reserved for contraband. But when the bag was empty, no weapons, no evidence, nothing to justify holding him, they still didn't stop. Renner glanced at the intake sheet, then pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. Suspicious behavior. Write it down. The second officer hesitated. Suspicious in what way? Renner shrugged, his mouth curling into a half-smile. Look at him. If he's not a criminal yet, he's just a future inmate. Tobias heard it all. He didn't turn around. He just quietly gathered his belongings, slipped his books back into the backpack, and wiped ketchup off the corner of a page using his sleeve. It was a silence so dense, it felt like it might burst. And then, as Renner scribbled into a meaningless form, Tobias looked up, voice steady. Did they train you to insult people even when there's no reason to? Renner froze. No one responded. None needed to. The cowardice wrapped in a uniform of procedure had just been exposed. Not with evidence, not with defiance, but with a single question. When Kendra Voss returned to retrieve Tobias, she found him standing tall, backpack over one shoulder, books neatly packed, as if he hadn't just been searched, demeaned, or bruised. And that, not blood, not tears, was what unsettled her most. Tobias didn't need to get angry, because the world around him was already showing its true face, without him having to say a word. Out in the hallway, Lila Brennan posted a photo of Tobias's necklace to Twitter with short caption, ink on his hands. But they saw an inmate. The hashtag he didn't flinch started appearing soon after. And this time, it needed no campaign. Just a boy who didn't lower his eyes. Because when people start calling abuse procedure, silence becomes the loudest form of indictment. That afternoon, Courtroom 2 of Fairborn District Court was more crowded than usual. News of the slap and of the necklace etched with FBI had begun to slip beyond the 4 courtroom walls. Reporters packed the hallway. A few cameras appeared. Even though the hearing wasn't being broadcast, Kendra Voss stood at the defense table, her voice sharpened like steel forged in flame. Your Honor, I moved to enter into evidence of video from the East Wing security camera at Kingsbury High School. The footage clearly shows that at 7:46 a.m., the defendant, Tobias Reed, engaged in no violent behavior as described by Officer Holt. The boy merely approached to intervene, as Officer Holt was in the process of striking an elderly homeless man. A ripple of whispers moved through the jury box. Judge Ronald Avery glanced at the USB drive Kendra handed to the clerk. He leaned forward, elbows on the bench, furrowed his brow as if to consider. But then his voice rang out. Unverified evidence. Not admissible. No blink. No inquiry into its source. No call to pause and verify. Just a nod. That familiar nod. Like brushing lint off the frayed hem of a justice robe that had seen too many compromises. Kendra held back a deep breath. Tobias showed no reaction. He simply looked at the judge as though watching an old movie. When he'd seen so many times, he'd lost count. The jury began to shift uneasily. Some exchanged glances. A middle-aged woman pursed her lips and flipped through her file as if trying to remind herself to believe in the system. But her eyes betrayed that belief was already gone. Tobias sat upright, gaze locked on Avery. Then, as if speaking the whole room, but also whispering to himself, he said softly, "Maybe I'll be the last to be buried with the truth, but at least I won't be the one who killed it." The word slid like a quiet blade across the courtroom's throat. Holt winced. Renner looked down. Judge Avery hesitated just a moment before hastily banging his gavel. Inadmissible remark. Stricken from the record. But what record? They could strike it from the transcript. But no one in that courtroom could erase what had just been spoken. Quiet but true, Lila Brennan, seated in the press row, leaned over her notebook and scribbled quickly. The truth doesn't need approval. It only needs someone willing to carry it to the grave. Outside, the tweet featuring the photo of Tobias, dry blood and silver necklace catching light, continued to spread. But inside the courtroom, the judges gnawed and a 16-year-old silence had redrawn the battlefield. Here, justice was no longer about authority, but about memory that refused to fade. After Tobias's line about being buried with the truth, no one said a word. The courtroom felt smothered in invisible fog, damp, heavy, choking. Even Judge Ronald Avery, who had long relied on his gavel to crush any flicker of dissent, now sat in silence. Then the large courtroom doors swung open. A tall man entered. No one had called for him. No one dared stop him. Dark gray suit, black tie, FBI, Deputy Director, glinting from the badge pinned on his left lapel. He didn't look at anyone. He walked straight ahead, step by step, as if he'd walked through 100 courtrooms like this in his lifetime. Dorian Reed, Tobias's father. The room fell into complete stillness. Dorian stood at the center aisle, just beneath the judge's bench. No request, no preamble. He looked directly at Judge Avery and said 3 words. "I am human." No anger, no raised voice. But each syllable landed like a hammer strike on the crumbling pillars of this courtroom. Judge Avery's voice tightened. "You are not permitted to speak unless called as a witness." Dorian interrupted, his tone unchanged. "I'm the father of the defendant. I'm the Deputy Director of the FBI for the Great Lakes region. And I am requesting a federal investigation into the misconduct of this courtroom of Officer Brandon Holt, and of you personally, Judge Ronald Avery." The shock spread through the courtroom like an electrical jolt. A female clerk dropped her pen. A juror furrowed his brow and quietly pull his coat over his name tag. And Holt could barely stay standing. Then an unexpected voice rose. A silver-haired man seated in the gallery stood up. No one recognized him until he spoke. "My name is Arthur Jennings, former Chief Justice of the state's Supreme Court. I'm willing to testify to the deceit occurring in this courtroom." He held up a small USB drive. "In my possession is an internal recording of Holt and Renner discussing how to teach that kid a lifelong lesson. What they didn't know is my office installed monitoring equipment in the holding room 3 months ago." The room erupted in whispers of disbelief. Judge Avery pounded his gavel until his hand went raw. But it was useless. Dorian Reed didn't flinch. "I am not asking for favors for my son. I'm asking for truth for a citizen who was beaten, falsely accused, and nearly railroaded, all because he dared to ask, 'Is this what you call the law?'" Tobias looked up, not surprised, but as if he had always known. He didn't need his father to speak for him to be saved. But he understood, at some point, even silence needs someone to speak on its behalf. And when that person walks with just 3 words, "I am human," even the oldest powers start to tremble. The atmosphere in Fairborn District Court grew taut like a violin string, as if one wrong breath could snap the whole facade in half. But the one who broke the silence didn't shout, didn't slam his fist. He simply made it official. Dorian Reed, his voice low and honed like steel that's been sharpened over decades, pulled out his phone and tapped a secured application. He didn't look at anyone except Judge Avery, but his words reached every ear. "By the authority of the FBI Deputy Director for the Great Lakes region, I am releasing verified footage retrieved from federal surveillance assets." Immediately, Lila Brennan, the freelance journalist who had followed the case closely, linked the court's projector to the live feed. The screen behind the judge flickered to life. The video began. Brandon Holt stood in the back parking lot of Kingsbury High. An elderly black man, hair silver and bent over a recycling bin, was suddenly shoved to the ground by Holt. Then, Holt raised his baton in threat. Tobias ran into frame, placing himself between the two. No punches, no aggressive moves, only a natural, instinctive action to protect the vulnerable. From the audio, "Don't touch him. He's just picking up bottles." The truth was raw, undeniable, and far more powerful than any closing argument. But that wasn't all. Dorian turned and raised his hand. "Along with this footage, we released the press part of the internal disciplinary file. It shows that Brandon Holt has been reported 3 times for violent and abusive conduct, twice involving black students, and once involving a school teacher. And all 3 cases were internally resolved by none other than Judge Ronald Avery." The whispers in the courtroom were no longer whispers. They had become a roar, the roar of justice that had been silenced for too long. The very bricks beneath the feet of those who thought themselves untouchable began to crack. Then Dorian gave a final order. "Agent Miller, arrest Brandon Holt, right here, right now." A gray-suited man by the courtroom door stepped forward, flashed his FBI credentials, and without a word, cuffed Holt. Holt tried to shout, but no one listened. The truth had already spoken louder than anything he could say. Judge Avery remained seated high above, still holding his gavel, but he didn't pound it. He said nothing. He didn't object, didn't deny. He just sat there, and in that silence, everyone understood that gavel no longer stood for justice. It was now just a stage prop in a theater the audience had already left. Tobias still sat in the defendant's chair. But this time, no one looked at him like a criminal. They looked at him as someone who had survived the brutal machinery of the system, without screaming, without fists, just a question, a look, and a truth so undeniable, even the most powerful man in the room couldn't bring down his gavel to reject it. News of Officer Brandon Holt being handcuffed mid-trial spread like wildfire. Less than an hour after the hearing, a 32-second clip showing the FBI agent pressing Holt's hands to the desk and reading him his rights was posted on journalist Lila Brennan's X, formerly Twitter, account with a single caption, #JusticeForTobias. But the hashtag that caught fire across the country was one name the nation had begun to remember. Hashtag Justice for Jalen. Jalen Dorian Reed, Tobias's real name, was no longer hidden behind silence. It appeared on T-shirts, on protest signs, across social feeds, not as a symbol of victimhood, but as a reminder that courage doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand up at the right moment. While hundreds of reporters, podcasts, and media crews flocked to Fairborn, the one person they wanted to interview most never stepped in front of a microphone. Jalen was released after 72 hours of unlawful detainment. But when he walked down the courthouse's old stone steps, amid a sea of cameras and microphones, he gave no speech. He made no accusations. He told no sob story. He simply stood there, a plain hoodie, a backpack, the bruise on his cheek still fading, his eyes fixed on something distant, somewhere beyond reach of any false testimony. A reporter called out, "Jalen, do you want to say anything?" He paused, then nodded slightly. When justice speaks for you, you don't have to yell. No one said anything after that. No one had to. Jalen's faint smile in that moment, barely enough to ripple a breeze, became the most shared photo of the week. Printed on newspaper covers, pasted on high school walls, preserved as a quiet reminder. Truth doesn't need noise to survive. It only needs someone calm enough not to become the kind of rebel the system expects. Dorian Reed stood not far behind, his eyes unblinking, not the look of a father who had won, but of a man who once thought he understood law, until his son taught him the law of dignified silence. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Dorian understood justice doesn't always wear power. Sometimes it wears emptiness and is carried by those who have nothing but the truth. That afternoon, Jalen Reed and his father didn't walk out the courthouse's front doors, where hundreds of reporters still waited. They exited through a side hallway, across the red brick corridor that led to a rear lawn, where there were no cameras, no microphones, only the late autumn sun stretching long across the quiet ground beneath their feet. Jalen said nothing, but he didn't lower his head. Silence was no longer a shield of fear. It was the only thing left strong enough to quiet the noise behind him. Farther off, a black car waited. Dorian opened the door, but didn't enter immediately. He looked at his son, not with concern, but with the quiet respect of a man who had just seen a young soul walk through a storm. No shouting, no resistance, only by holding his ground. "You all right?" Dorian asked, his voice low. Jalen nodded gently. Justice doesn't need drums. Sometimes it just needs someone patient enough to wait for others to see what's always there. Dorian smiled faintly. No more words. They got in the car. On the other side of the courthouse, out of every camera's frame, Judge Ronald Avery stepped onto the balcony of his office. He stood still, looking down at the courtyard where Jalen had just walked away, his eyes sunken, hands gripping the railing like he was holding on to something that no longer had a name. On his desk behind him, his letter of resignation lay signed. Outside, high schools across the state began hosting open forums on racial bias and justice. One literature teacher added Jalen's words to an essay exam prompt. "When justice speaks for you, you don't have to yell." A young attorney in Seattle wrote in a status update, "I don't want to be the one who wins the case. I want to be the one who makes the entire system listen, even when I say nothing." And that quiet shift was the real victory, because justice isn't a handcuff. It isn't the judge's gavel. It isn't a viral tweet with 1 million shares. Justice is when a 16-year-old black boy stands in a courtroom thick with bias, doesn't shout, doesn't beg, and still makes the entire system bow before the truth. They didn't leave through the main doors. They walked through another, one meant for those who no longer need to prove anything. And from that quiet step forward, an entire society began to listen again, not because of the noise, but because there was a silence loud enough to be heard,